So you want to be a medieval executioner. Here is a detail they never put in the movies. In many German-speaking cities across the 14th and 15th centuries, the executioner was also the town's only reliable source of medical care for the poor. Not because he had studied medicine, because he had taken apart enough human bodies on the scaffold to know where everything was and roughly what it did. The same hands that swung the sword on Tuesday would set a broken bone on Thursday, and the patient would pay him quietly, in cash, through the back door, because being seen visiting the executioner's house was a social catastrophe roughly equivalent to announcing your own bankruptcy in the town square. He could fix you, but admitting he fixed you could ruin you. This is the kind of job you are walking into tonight, a role so tangled in contradiction that the man doing it was simultaneously the most needed and most untouchable person in the city. The town could not function without him and could not bear to acknowledge he existed. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these, and drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself comfortable and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in, let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. How much did an executioner actually earn per head, and was it enough to live on? Why was a botched execution sometimes more dangerous for the executioner than for the condemned? What happened when an executioner's daughter tried to marry a baker's son? Was there a professional guild for executioners? And if so, what exactly did the meetings look like? Why did some executioners become genuinely wealthy while most lived in quiet poverty? Could an executioner ever quit? Who supplied the rope, the sword, and the wood for the scaffold? And who paid for it all? It is a Wednesday morning in a city that smells of wood smoke and open drains. You are awake before dawn because there is a horse carcass to collect before the market opens, and your neighbors would prefer not to be reminded what else your hands do for a living. So let us talk about how you got here, because you did not apply for this job. You did not stumble into it through bad luck or poor choices or a catastrophic misunderstanding at the career fair. You were born into it. The executioner's trade, across most of medieval and early modern Europe, was hereditary. It passed from father to son the way a blacksmith's forge passed through families, or a merchant's trading house passed through families, except that inheriting this particular line of work did not come with social standing, guild membership, or the right to drink in the same tavern as the people whose laws you enforced. It came with a legal classification that would follow you, your wife, your children, and your grandchildren for as long as the family name survived, and it came with no exit. There is a popular version of how executioners came to be, and it is almost entirely wrong. The romantic version goes something like this. A condemned man is standing on the scaffold. The city has no executioner. Some official offers him a deal. Swing the sword for us, and we will spare your life. A criminal turned executioner, doing the state's dirty work in exchange for his own neck. It is a powerful image. It appears in novels, in films, in the kind of history content that confuses drama for research. And in a tiny handful of documented cases, something like this did happen. Early in the profession's history, in scattered towns without an established executioner, a condemned man was occasionally pressed into service. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, when the role had become formalized across the cities of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, the overwhelming reality was different. The executioner was not a criminal, he was a professional. And he was almost always the son of another professional who had done the same work before him. The Brants of Brandenburg passed the sword from father to son for over a century. The Franz family served in several Bavarian cities across multiple generations. The Widmans held the post in Augsburg. The most famous dynasty of all, the Sansons of Paris, would eventually stretch across 7 generations, with the final Charles-Henri Sanson operating the guillotine during the French Revolution. These were not random, desperate men picking up an axe out of necessity. These were families. lineages as deep and as carefully documented as minor nobility, except the documentation lived in civic payroll records rather than court registers, and the inheritance was a blade rather than a title. And the reason these dynasties existed was not tradition or pride or any romantic notion of family honor. The reason was simpler and uglier. Nobody else would do it, or rather, nobody else could do it without destroying their own social standing in the process. Because the executioner carried a legal classification that functioned like a contagious disease, except it spread through employment rather than through contact with bodily fluids. That classification had a name, unheurlich, dishonorable. Unheurlich did not mean what you think it means. It did not mean dishonorable the way a modern person might use the word, as a vague moral judgment, a suggestion that someone had behaved badly. It was a formal legal status, written into civic codes, enforced by guilds, churches, and city councils with the same bureaucratic thoroughness they brought to tax collection and zoning disputes. If you were classified as unehrlich, the rules of your life were different from everyone else's. And the differences were not subtle. You could not join a guild. In a medieval city, where guild membership was the gateway to almost every skilled trade, this alone was devastating. It meant your sons could not apprentice as bakers, butchers, coopers, carpenters, masons, tailors, or goldsmiths. The entire world of respectable craftsmanship was closed to your family by default. You could not give testimony in court that carried the same weight as an honorable citizen's word. In legal disputes, your voice was worth less. In many cities, you could not enter certain taverns, not because the tavern keeper personally disliked you, but because allowing a dishonorable person to drink alongside honorable patrons could contaminate the establishment's reputation. The Guild of Tavern Keepers had rules about this, actual written rules. You sat in a separate pew at church, if you were permitted in the church building at all. In some jurisdictions, the executioner's family attended services from a designated area, usually at the very back, physically separated from the congregation. In others, they stood outside the door and listened to the sermon through the wood. And here is the part that sealed the cage shut with a lock that had no key. You could not marry outside the dishonorable trades. This was not a social convention. It was not a matter of families quietly preferring that their children marry within the same class. It was enforced. If the baker's son wanted to marry the executioner's daughter, the Bakers' Guild could, and routinely did, object. The marriage would contaminate the baker's family with the dishonorable classification. The Bakers' Guild would threaten to expel the family. Other tradesmen might refuse to do business with them. The social and economic consequences were real, immediate, and severe enough that almost nobody risked it. Your daughter could be the cleverest, kindest, most capable young woman in the city. She could be beautiful, she could be witty, she could be everything a young man's family might want. And the baker's son could not marry her. The butcher's son could not. The weaver's son could not. The only men your daughter could marry were the sons of knackers, gravediggers, tanners, or other executioners. Families like yours. Families who carried the same invisible mark. Think about the mathematics of that for a moment. The dishonorable trades were a small population. In any given city, you might have one executioner's family, one or two knacker families, a handful of tanners, a few gravediggers. That is your entire marriage pool. Your daughter's romantic future is not just socially constrained, it is statistically constrained. The chances of finding a compatible match within that tiny pool were slim. The chances of finding one in the same city were slimmer. Executioner families routinely married across cities, sending daughters dozens of miles away to marry the son of another executioner in another town, because there was simply nobody suitable closer to home. It is the medieval equivalent of a dating app with 11 users, all of whom are in adjacent professions involving dead things. You are born into a profession that makes you untouchable. You can only marry people who are also untouchable. Your children are therefore born untouchable. They can only marry other untouchable people. And around it goes, generation after generation, a closed loop of inherited exclusion, until the family dies out or someone travels far enough that nobody recognizes the surname. We know specific families who endured this for lifetimes, and we know specific families who simply vanish from the records. No marriages recorded for the daughters, no sons taking up the sword. The civic payroll lists an executioner one decade and a different name the next, with no explanation of what happened to the family in between. The silence in the archive is its own kind of story. Now, you are a child in one of these families. You are 5, 6, 7 years old. You live in a house that sits slightly outside the city walls, or on the very edge of town near the knacker's yard and the tanning pits, because respectable citizens have made it clear, through centuries of ordinance and complaint, that they do not want you as a neighbor. Your house might actually be quite solid. In some cities, the executioner's residence was provided and maintained by the council, and it was not always a hovel. Nuremberg's executioner had a decent stone house. Several Bavarian executioners lived in homes that were structurally better than what many honorable tradesmen occupied. But the location told everyone who walked past exactly what your father did for a living. The house was not hidden. It was deliberately placed where it could be both accessible and avoidable, close enough to summon when the court needed killing done, far enough that nobody had to think about it over breakfast. And the other children know what your father does. They know before you fully understand it yourself. They know because their parents have told them, or because the house's location speaks for itself, or because in a medieval town of 2,000 or 3,000 people, everybody knows everything about everyone, especially the things that come with legal classifications and formal social boundaries. You are not invited to play. You are not included when the other boys run through the market square, or wrestle by the river, or chase each other through the churchyard after services. You are not necessarily beaten. It is not always violent. That would almost be easier to understand, because violence at least acknowledges that you exist. What happens instead is something more quietly devastating. You are simply not there. You occupy a space that other families have agreed, without ever formally discussing it, to treat as empty. Your mother goes to the market and the baker sells her bread, because commerce does not pause for social disgust, but nobody lingers to talk. Nobody asks how the children are doing. Nobody mentions your family at the harvest celebration, because your family was not invited to the harvest celebration. You are surrounded by a city full of people who depend on your father's professional skill and have collectively decided to pretend he is a ghost. The modern comparison is imperfect, but it opens a door. Think about the jobs that exist today, that everyone agrees are necessary, that everyone benefits from directly, and that almost nobody wants to discuss at a dinner party. Sanitation workers, slaughterhouse employees, the people who clean up after violent crimes, the people who work in sewage treatment, the people who process human remains at funeral homes. Society needs these roles to function. Without them, civilized life collapses within days. And yet, there is a persistent, quiet, mostly unspoken assumption that something about the work sticks to the person who does it. Nobody crosses the street to avoid a garbage collector, but there is a subtle ambient discomfort that most people would deny if asked about it directly. Now imagine that discomfort was not subtle. Imagine it was not something people denied. Imagine it was written into law, enforced by every guild and every church and every civic institution in your city, and transmitted to your children as automatically as your surname. That is what unehrlich meant. That is the air you are breathing tonight. And here is the part that would be funny if it were not so suffocating. Your father is not a bad man. He is not cruel. He is not a criminal. He has not done anything wrong by any standard except the one his society has invented specifically to describe people like him. In most documented cases, the medieval executioner was a sober, careful, deeply professional person who took his work seriously because taking it seriously was the only way to survive. A sloppy executioner was a dead executioner, or at best, an unemployed one. and unemployment in this profession meant destitution, because no other trade would take you. Your father maintains his tools with a surgeon's precision. He studies the human body with genuine care, not out of morbid curiosity, but because knowing where the vertebrae sit and how the neck muscles work is the difference between a clean death and a catastrophe that could cost him his own life. He knows more practical anatomy than the barber surgeon across town who charges twice as much to leech a fever. He is, by almost any objective measure, one of the most skilled and knowledgeable tradesmen in the city, and he is treated as though his skin has been permanently stained with something that no amount of scrubbing will ever reach. But you are not standing in this alone. Your family is not the only family living under this classification. Your world is about to get wider and stranger and considerably more bureaucratically absurd because medieval society had constructed an entire ecosystem of social contamination, and the logic holding it together was the kind of logic that sounds perfectly reasonable until you examine it for more than 11 seconds. The dishonorable trades were a formal legal category, a surprisingly detailed, surprisingly well-maintained formal legal category, and the executioner sat at its center, at the very bottom of a hierarchy that was itself already beneath the floor of respectable society. But he had company down there, and the company was varied and fascinating. Knackers, the people who disposed of dead animals, collected carcasses from the streets and fields, and rendered them down for fat and bone. They touched dead things professionally, and that was enough. Gravediggers. They also touched dead things, but human dead things, which was somehow both different and the same. Tanners. They worked with animal hides and with the truly horrifying chemicals needed to cure leather. Chemicals whose smell was so powerful and so persistent that tanning operations were pushed to the edges of every town in Europe for purely practical olfactory reasons, and then socially punished for being there, as though the location had been their choice. Shepherds, in some regions, because apparently spending too much time alone with animals in open fields raised questions about your moral character that polite society preferred to imply rather than state. Bathhouse keepers, in certain cities, because of the association between public bathing and prostitution. Linen weavers, in others, for reasons that even historians struggle to explain with full confidence. Bailiffs and court messengers, because their work brought them into contact with criminals. Musicians and traveling performers, because rootlessness itself was considered a form of social contamination. The list varied by region and by century, in ways that revealed just how arbitrary the whole system was. A linen weaver in one city was dishonorable. The same linen weaver, doing the same work 30 miles down the road, was perfectly respectable. A shepherd was contaminated in Bavaria and unremarkable in Saxony. The inconsistency was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Each city and territory maintained its own list of polluted occupations, updated its own regulations, and enforced its own boundaries with the sincere conviction that they were protecting the social order from a very real form of corruption. The fact that the city next door had a completely different list did not seem to trouble anyone. The logic, if you can call it that, came down to contact. If your work brought you into regular physical contact with things that society had classified as unclean, you became unclean. Dead animals, dead humans, human waste, certain animal products in their raw form, certain chemicals. The contamination was not medical. Nobody believed you were carrying a transmissible disease. It was spiritual, social, ambient, a sense that something about the nature of the work entered you through your hands and settled into your identity and could not be washed out, no matter how many years you spent doing anything else afterward. And because it could not be washed out of you, it could not be washed out of your children, who had never touched a dead animal or swung a sword in their lives, and it could not be washed out of anyone foolish enough to marry into your family and absorb your classification along with your surname, which meant the dishonorable trades formed their own closed social universe, a shadow city inside the city. You married within it. You socialized within it. You drank in the taverns that would serve you, if any would. Your children played with the knacker's children, and the tanner's children, and the gravedigger's children, because those were the only children whose parents would permit the contact. The executioner's wife and the gravedigger's wife might nod to each other at the market with the quiet solidarity of people who understand the same silence. In some cities, the dishonorable families were permitted to attend church services, but sat together in a designated section, usually at the very back or along a side wall, physically present in the house of God, but quarantined from the congregation that worshipped the same God, and read the same scripture, and presumably believed in the same divine mercy, except when it came to seating arrangements. In other cities, they stood outside the door and listened to the sermon through the timber. The consistency was never in the specific rules. It was in the underlying message. You are necessary, you are permanent, and you are not one of us. And here is where the absurdity reaches its full, glorious, magnificently unself-aware bloom. The tanner was dishonorable because he worked with dead animal skins, but the merchant who sold the finished leather, the beautiful, supple, meticulously crafted leather that the tanner's expertise had produced, was perfectly honorable. The merchant's hands were clean because the product had passed through enough intermediate commercial steps that nobody thought about the stinking pit where it started. The glover who cut that leather into fine ladies' gloves was honorable. The saddler who shaped it into riding equipment was honorable. Only the man at the beginning of the chain, the man whose skill made the entire industry possible, was unclean. The executioner was dishonorable because he killed people on the direct, explicit, written orders of the court. But the judge who handed down the death sentence went home in his fine robes and sat at the head of his table and was considered one of the most respectable men in the city. The judge decided the killing. The executioner performed the killing. The judge's hands were clean because the killing happened in a different building, performed by a different pair of hands, even though every person present understood that without the judge's word, the executioner's sword would have stayed in its sheath. It is the oldest trick in the history of organized society. Someone has to do the thing that everyone agrees needs doing, so you find someone to do it. And then you treat them as though the thing they did was their own moral failing, rather than your institutional requirement. The distance between ordering a death and performing a death was, in practical terms, nothing. A signature and a walk across town. In social terms, it was the distance between the head of the table and the far side of the city wall. And the executioner sat on the wrong side of that wall, in a solid house that the city had provided, eating food that the city's wages had paid for, sharpening a sword that the city had commissioned, and waiting for the next piece of paper that would tell him the city needed him again. There is a particular kind of irony in the fact that a skilled executioner in a major city could earn more money in a year than a journeyman carpenter or a middling baker. The fees were not generous on a per-job basis, and they were wildly irregular, and we will get into exactly how the money worked later tonight in detail that might surprise you. But in pure financial terms, the executioner was not always poor. Some executioners lived in well-built houses with decent furniture, warm hearths, and enough food on the table that hunger was not among their problems. The Sansons accumulated genuine wealth across their 7 generations in Paris. Several German executioners left estates that were larger than those of neighboring craftsmen. And none of it mattered. None of it. Not one coin of it. A carpenter earning half the executioner's annual income could walk into any tavern in the city and order a drink and sit at any table and talk to anyone he pleased. The executioner, earning twice the carpenter's wages, could not get through the door. The money was real. The status was not. You could have silver in your purse and meat on your table and still be, in the eyes of every guild, every church, every neighbor, and every legal institution in the city, less than the poorest honest laborer who went to bed hungry but went to bed honorable. Wealth without status, income without belonging. It is not an entirely unfamiliar combination even now, but in the modern world, the gap between earning well and being accepted is usually a matter of awkwardness, of subtle social friction, of someone at a party not quite knowing how to respond when you tell them what you do. Here it was law. Here it was codified, categorized, and enforced, with the kind of painstaking municipal thoroughness that only a medieval German bureaucracy could truly perfect. The city needed you. The city hired you. The city paid you. The city gave you a house. And the city made absolutely certain that you understood, every single day, in every interaction, and every institution, and every closed tavern door, that you were not part of it. You were the thing that made the machine run, and you were not welcome inside the machine. That is the world you are growing up in tonight. A house near the city walls. A father who sharpens his tools in the yard before dawn. A mother who buys bread at a market where the baker's eyes never quite meet hers for longer than the transaction requires. Brothers who will follow your father onto the scaffold because there is nothing else to follow him into. And a future that was decided before you drew your first breath, sealed before you spoke your first word, locked before you were old enough to understand what the lock was or why it existed or that there had ever been a key. And sooner than you think, your father takes you to the yard behind the house and puts something heavy in your hands. You are not a child anymore, or rather, you are still a child by any reasonable standard, 12, 13, 14 years old, but reasonable standards have never applied to your family, and they are not about to start now. Your apprenticeship has begun, and the first thing you learn is that almost everything you have ever heard about how an execution works is wrong. Here is the version most people carry in their heads. A big man with an axe, a wooden block. The condemned kneels down, puts their neck on the block, and the big man swings. Simple, brutal, requiring nothing more than a strong back and a willingness to do something terrible. It is the version that appears in every painting and every film and every half-remembered history lesson, and it describes, at best, one particular method used primarily in England. Across the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, across France, across much of continental Europe, the preferred method of execution for centuries was not the axe at all. It was the sword. And the sword changed everything about what this job required. A sword execution did not use a block. The condemned stood upright, or knelt upright, with their neck exposed and unsupported. There was nothing to rest against, nothing to guide the blade. The executioner stood to the side, drew the sword back, and swung in a single horizontal arc, aimed at the narrow gap between two vertebrae in the neck. The goal was a clean separation in one stroke, one swing, one cut. A head that fell cleanly, and a body that dropped without thrashing. That was the professional standard. Anything less was a failure, and failure in this job did not mean a poor performance review and a note in your file. Failure meant the crowd turning on you. Think about the physics for a moment. You are swinging a blade that weighs somewhere between 3 and 5 pounds, depending on the specific weapon, in a precise horizontal arc at a target roughly 4 inches wide. You need enough speed to cut through muscle, tendon, and the cartilage between vertebrae in a single motion. You need enough accuracy to hit the right gap, because striking bone, rather than the space between bones, means the blade catches, slows, and stops partway through, which means you have just inflicted a massive wound on a living person without killing them, and now you have to pull the sword free and swing again while the condemned is screaming and the crowd is screaming and your hands are slippery and your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your jaw. The margin for error is measured in inches. The consequence for error is measured in blood, public fury, and potentially your own death. This is not a job for a strong man with an axe. This is a job for a specialist, and specialists are trained. Your father teaches you the way his father taught him. The curriculum is not written down in any formal sense, but it follows a pattern that executioner families passed along for generations. You start with objects, pumpkins and gourds, set on posts at roughly the height of a kneeling person's neck. You practice the swing, not the strength of it, the arc of it. The sword does not chop, it slices. The motion is closer to a scythe cutting wheat than an axe splitting wood. You are drawing the blade through the target, not hammering it into the target. The difference sounds subtle. In practice, it is the difference between a clean death and a catastrophe. After gourds come straw bundles wrapped in wet cloth, because wet cloth resists a blade the way flesh does, and the bundles teach you what real resistance feels like in your wrists and shoulders. After straw bundles come animal carcasses. A dead pig's neck is not identical to a human neck, but it is close enough in terms of muscle density and tissue resistance that it has been the preferred training material for executioners across centuries and across borders. You practice on carcasses until the motion is automatic, until your body knows the angle and the speed and the follow-through without your mind having to calculate it. Because on the day you do this for real, in front of hundreds or sometimes thousands of people, with a living human being kneeling in front of you and the entire city watching, your mind will not be calculating anything. Your mind will be somewhere between terror and blankness. Only your muscles will be working, and they had better know what they are doing. The sword itself requires its own education. An execution sword is not a fighting sword. It is purpose-built. The blade is typically broad, flat, and heavy, designed to carry momentum through a cut, rather than to parry or thrust. The tip is squared off or rounded, because you will never stab with this weapon. Its only function is a single lateral cut, repeated as few times as humanly possible across a career that might span decades. Many execution swords carried inscriptions on the blade, words in Latin or German, often invoking divine justice or the authority of the law, etched into the steel that would do the actual work. The inscription was not for the condemned to read, it was for the executioner, a reminder, built into the tool itself, that the killing was sanctioned, that it was lawful, that God and the court had agreed this death should happen. Whether the executioner believed that reminder after his 50th or 100th or 200th killing is a question the inscriptions do not answer. You learn to maintain the blade with the same obsessive care a surgeon would give a scalpel, because functionally, that is what it is. A dull sword does not cut cleanly. A dull sword catches on tissue, slows in bone, and turns a one-stroke execution into a two-stroke or three-stroke execution, which turns a solemn legal proceeding into a horror show, and turns a professional executioner into a man running for his life from an angry mob. Sharpening is not a chore. Sharpening is survival. You learn which stones to use, and at what angle, and how to test the edge, and how to store the blade so that moisture does not pit the steel. You learn that the sword must be cleaned immediately after use, because blood, left on iron, corrodes faster than almost any other substance, and a corroded blade is a blade that will fail you at the worst possible moment. Your father also teaches you the other methods, because beheading with the sword is the prestige method, but it is not the only one. Hanging requires its own expertise. The length of the drop matters. Too short, and the condemned strangles slowly, which is agonizing to watch and can take several minutes. Too long, and the head separates from the body entirely, which is faster, but showers the front rows of the crowd in blood, and is considered excessive even by the standards of people who have come to watch a person die. The ideal drop breaks the neck cleanly. Calculating that drop requires estimating the condemned person's weight, which you do by looking at them, and adjusting the rope length accordingly, which you do by experience. There is no manual. There is no formula printed in a book. There is your father telling you what worked and what did not, and there is your own accumulating experience, each execution teaching you something that no other profession in the city could teach you. Breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, drowning. Each method has its own choreography, its own tools, its own technical requirements, and its own ways of going wrong. You learn them all, Not because you will use them all frequently, but because the court decides the method, not you. And when the court orders a breaking on the wheel, you do not get to suggest that a nice clean beheading might be more efficient. You are a civil servant. You execute the sentence as specified. The word execute, in fact, means exactly this: to carry out, to perform. You are the instrument. The court is the hand. And then comes the day when the gourds and the straw bundles and the pig carcasses are behind you, and there is a living person kneeling on the scaffold, and the sword is in your hands, and it is real. Nobody writes about this moment in the official records. The civic documents record the name of the condemned, the crime, the sentence, the date. They do not record what the executioner felt, but we can reconstruct it from the edges, from the accounts of executioners who developed tremors in their hands after years of work, from the records of executioners who drank heavily before and after executions, not out of moral indifference, but out of the need to steady themselves enough to perform a task that required absolute physical precision under absolute psychological pressure. From the fact that some executioner families specifically noted which sons had the temperament for the work and which did not, suggesting that the capacity to do this job was recognized as something beyond mere technical training. You could teach a young man to swing a sword. You could not always teach a young man to swing a sword at a living neck. The closest modern comparison, and it is still not close enough, is a surgeon performing an operation in a stadium in front of 10,000 people who will attack them if they make a mistake. The physical precision required is comparable. The consequences of failure are comparable. The pressure is comparable. But the surgeon is saving a life. You are ending one. And when the surgeon goes home, their neighbors invite them to dinner. When you go home, your neighbors pretend your house is not there. Every execution you perform successfully adds to your reputation and, more importantly, to your safety. A known, reliable executioner is tolerated. The city may not like you, but the city trusts you, and trust, in this profession, is the only currency that matters more than the fee. A botched execution erodes that trust. 2 botched executions can end a career. 3 can end a life, and not through any formal legal process, but through the simple, ancient, terrifyingly efficient mechanism of a crowd that has decided it has seen enough incompetence and is not willing to watch a 4th attempt. Your father knows this. He has watched it happen to executioners in other cities. He has heard the stories that pass through the small, closed network of executioner families, stories about the man in Augsburg who needed 5 strokes and was beaten so badly by the crowd that he never worked again, about the man in a Franconian town who botched a hanging and was nearly hanged himself by the spectators. These stories are not entertainment. They are professional education. They are the reason your father started putting a sword in your hands when you were barely old enough to lift it. They are the reason you have spent years swinging at gourds and straw and dead pigs. Because the day you step onto that scaffold for real, there will be no second chance to learn. There will be one swing, and everything you are, everything your family is, everything your father built across decades of careful, precise, lonely, despised work, will depend on whether your muscles remember what your mind has forgotten how to think about. And the tools you carry to that scaffold are worth talking about, because they are fascinating objects in their own right, and because the economics of equipping an executioner reveals something important about how medieval cities thought about the business of death. The sword is the centerpiece. An execution sword was a commissioned weapon. It was not pulled from a rack at a blacksmith shop or borrowed from a soldier's armory. It was made to order by a bladesmith who was willing to take the commission, which was not always easy to find. Smiths belonged to guilds. Guilds had opinions about honor and dishonor. A bladesmith who forged a weapon specifically designed to kill unarmed, bound, kneeling human beings was, in the eyes of some guilds, flirting with contamination. Not all smiths refused. The commission paid well, but the negotiation itself reveals the reach of the executioner's stigma. Even the man who made your tools had to weigh whether the money was worth the social risk of being known as the man who made the executioner's sword. The cost of a quality execution sword in the 14th or 15th century varied by region and by the reputation of the smith, but surviving records suggest it could run to several gulden, which translates to roughly 2 to 4 months of a common laborer's total wages. This was not a trivial purchase. In some cities, the council paid for the sword as part of equipping the executioner's post. In others, the executioner was expected to provide his own tools, and the cost came out of his earnings. The distinction mattered enormously because execution fees were irregular and not always generous, and a man who had to spend 4 months of a laborer's wages on his primary tool before he could earn a single coin from using it was starting his career in a financial hole. The sword was not the only expense. Rope for hangings had to be purchased and replaced regularly. A gallows was a permanent structure that required maintenance, timber replacement, and occasional rebuilding, and the question of who paid for the upkeep of the gallows was a recurring item in city council minutes across dozens of German and Swiss cities. The records survive because bureaucrats are eternal, and the bureaucrats of medieval Europe documented their budget arguments with the same exhaustive thoroughness that modern bureaucrats bring to spreadsheets. Scaffolding for public executions had to be built and dismantled. The wheel for braking required specific construction, a heavy wooden wagon wheel mounted horizontally on a post, strong enough to support a human body and withstand repeated blows from an iron bar. The stake for burning required timber, kindling, and enough fuel to sustain a fire hot enough to kill, which was more than you might think. Even the simple act of drowning a condemned person required equipment, a sack, a weight, a boat or a bridge, and someone to handle the logistics. Then there were the tools of torture, because the executioner was not only the man who killed, he was also, in most jurisdictions, the man who tortured. When the court ordered judicial torture as part of an interrogation, and courts ordered this far more routinely than modern people are comfortable knowing, it was the executioner who performed it. Thumbscrews. The strappado, which involved hoisting the accused by their wrists, tied behind their back, dislocating the shoulders with slow, mechanical precision. Heated implements applied to specific parts of the body according to specific legal protocols, because even torture had paperwork. The tools for this work were specialized, durable, and expensive. A full set of judicial torture implements represented a significant capital investment, and the executioner was expected to maintain them in working order the way a craftsman maintained any professional toolkit. Follow the sword through its full life, and it tells you something about the strange, closed world it belonged to. It was forged by a smith who may have hesitated before accepting the commission. It was paid for by either the city or the executioner, depending on local custom. It was maintained with obsessive care, because a dull blade was a professional death sentence. It was used, at most, a handful of times per year in a typical city, because executions were not daily events. It was cleaned immediately after each use. It was sharpened regularly, regardless of use, because even idle steel degrades. It was stored carefully, wrapped in oiled cloth, kept dry, protected from the damp air that ate through iron like slow acid. It was, in many cases, inscribed with words that reminded its owner that the killing was just. And when the executioner died or retired, and his son took over, the sword passed to the son the way a crown passes to a prince, except the crown opens doors and the sword closes them. Some execution swords survive in museums today. They are sobering objects. Broad-bladed, heavy, unadorned except for their inscriptions, they look like what they are: tools built for a single, terrible purpose, designed with the same care and precision that went into any other piece of medieval craftsmanship, because the medieval world did not distinguish between noble tools and ignoble tools. A tool was well made, or it was not. The sword that took a life was forged with the same skill that forged the sword that defended a city wall. The difference was entirely in what happened to the man who held it afterward. In the rare cases where an executioner family line ended, where the last son died or fled or refused the work, the sword presented a problem. It could not easily be sold. No honorable citizen wanted to own it. No guild would accept it as collateral. It was an object of enormous professional value and zero social value. Some were kept by the city council as property of the post, passed to the next executioner hired from wherever they could find one. Some were destroyed. Some were simply lost, absorbed into the general mass of old metal, melted down, reforged into something that did not carry the memory of what it had been. And some survived, ending up centuries later behind glass, in temperature-controlled rooms where tourists glance at them and move on to the next display, never quite understanding that the heavy, flat, rounded blade they are looking at was the center of a family's entire existence for generations. The thing that fed them, the thing that defined them, the thing that trapped them. The city paid for the scaffold, the city paid for the rope, the city paid, sometimes, for the sword. The city paid, always, for the killing. What the city did not pay for was the cost of being the person who used these tools. That cost was extracted in a different currency, one that no civic budget line could capture and no council minute could record. The cost was the life you lived between executions, the mornings in the yard, sharpening a blade you hoped you would not need this month, the afternoons disposing of animal carcasses because the execution fees alone could not keep your family fed, the evenings in a house that was solid enough but sat on the wrong side of a wall that was not made of stone but was more impassable than any fortification the city had ever built. Your tools are ready. Your training is complete, or as complete as training can be, for a job that only reveals its true difficulty when a real person is kneeling in front of you, with their neck exposed, and the crowd is watching, and there is no gourd, no straw bundle, no dead pig, just a human being, just a sword, and just you, the person the entire city has agreed should carry the weight of this moment so that nobody else has to. Now, let us walk through the day you have been training for your entire life, because execution day was not a grim, private affair conducted in some dark chamber behind locked doors. It was a public event, a civic spectacle, a day the city turned out for the way it turned out for a market fair or a Saints' Day procession, except the main attraction was a person dying, and the audience had opinions about how well it was done. The day begins early. Hours before the execution, a sequence of bureaucratic and spiritual rituals unfolds that reveals just how thoroughly the medieval justice system had formalized the act of killing a human being. The condemned has already been tried, sentenced, and held in a cell that you, in many jurisdictions, are responsible for maintaining. Not the prison itself, which belongs to the city, but the condemned cell, which sits in a gray area of civic responsibility that somehow always seems to land on the executioner's side of the ledger. You may have fed the condemned their last meal. In some cities, the executioner was expected to provide this meal out of his own pocket and submit the expense to the city for reimbursement, which the city sometimes paid promptly and sometimes did not, because municipal accounting in the 15th century moved at exactly the pace you would expect from a system that recorded everything in longhand on parchment. The last meal itself was not the elaborate feast that modern popular culture imagines. It was food, decent food, usually better than what the condemned had been eating in their cell, but not a banquet. Bread, meat, if available, wine or beer. The gesture was not generosity, it was ritual. The meal marked the transition from prisoner to condemned, from a person the law was holding to a person the law was about to kill. After the meal came confession. A priest visited the cell, heard the condemned's final confession, offered absolution, and prayed with them. The executioner was often present for this. In some jurisdictions, the executioner was required to pray with the condemned as well, which created a scene of surreal intimacy. The man who was about to kill you knelt beside you and prayed for your soul. The man whose own spiritual status was uncertain at best asked God to receive the person he was about to send to God by force. Then the procession. This was the public part, the part the city came to see, and it followed a specific route through the streets from the prison to the place of execution. The order of the procession was prescribed. At the front, city guards or soldiers, then the condemned, walking or carried in a cart, depending on the jurisdiction and the nature of the crime. Then the priest, still praying, still offering comfort. Then the executioner, walking behind or alongside, carrying his tools or having them carried for him. And alongside the entire procession, flanking it, pressing against it, leaning out of windows above it, the crowd. The crowd is worth understanding, because the crowd is the thing that makes this job not just physically demanding and socially ruinous, but genuinely, immediately dangerous. A medieval execution crowd was not a solemn, respectful audience, observing the administration of justice. It was a crowd, a medieval crowd, with all that implies. Vendors sold food along the route and at the execution site. Broadsheet sellers hawked printed accounts of the condemned's crimes, sometimes accurate, sometimes wildly embellished, always designed to sell. Families brought children. People jockeyed for position the way concert audiences pressed toward the stage. There was noise. There was energy. There was the particular electricity that comes from a large group of people gathered to watch something extraordinary happen, regardless of whether the extraordinary thing is a celebration or a killing. It is the medieval equivalent of a stadium event with no assigned seating, no security barriers, and an audience that considers itself an active participant rather than a passive observer. Because the crowd had expectations, they had come to see a death, and they expected that death to be performed competently. A clean beheading in one stroke was greeted with something between approval and relief. The crowd might cheer. They might simply exhale. The transaction was complete. The law had been served. The executioner had done his job. Everyone could go home, satisfied that the machinery of justice was functioning properly. But if it went wrong, if the sword missed its mark, or caught on bone, or bounced off a neck that the condemned had tensed at the last moment, if the first stroke merely wounded and a second or third stroke was needed, the crowd's mood changed with a speed and ferocity that could be genuinely life-threatening. For the executioner, you are standing on the scaffold. You have swung. You have missed the gap between the vertebrae. The sword has bitten into the side of the neck, but has not gone through. The condemned is still alive, bleeding catastrophically, screaming or moaning, or making a sound that is worse than either. The crowd, which was buzzing with anticipation 10 seconds ago, has gone silent for exactly one heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, you can feel the mood shift like a weather front passing over open ground. The silence breaks into noise, shouting, cursing, objects thrown. A botched execution was not considered an unfortunate professional error. It was considered a moral failure, a sign that the executioner was incompetent, or drunk, or cursed, or that God himself had intervened to signal that this particular death was unjust. Any of these interpretations was bad for you. All of them could get you killed. The historical record contains cases that read like nightmares. In Nuremberg, an executioner who required multiple strokes was pelted with stones and chased from the scaffold. In several documented incidents across German-speaking cities, crowds physically attacked the executioner after a botched execution, beating him severely enough that he could not work for weeks or months. In extreme cases, the crowd killed the executioner on the spot, an act of mob justice so grimly ironic that it seems like it should be fictional, but is not. The crowd, gathered to watch the lawful killing of a condemned criminal, became so enraged by the executioner's failure to kill cleanly that they committed the exact same act, unlawfully, against the executioner himself. And the institutional response was not always sympathetic. A botched execution embarrassed the court. It embarrassed the city council. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether the right man had been hired for the job. In some jurisdictions, an executioner who botched a killing faced formal consequences: fines, reduction in fees, temporary or permanent dismissal. In rare cases, prosecution, not for the botching itself, but for the broader charge of incompetence in a public office. The court that had ordered the killing was not interested in hearing about your nerves or your trembling hands or the fact that the condemned moved at the last second. The court wanted results. Clean, efficient, one-stroke results. If you could not deliver them, the court would find someone who could, which in practical terms meant finding another executioner's son from another city who was willing to relocate to a place where his predecessor had been chased off the scaffold by an angry mob. Not an easy recruitment pitch. There is a terrible spiral hidden inside this. An executioner who botched an execution was more likely to botch the next one, not because he had suddenly lost his skill, but because the experience of failure in front of a hostile crowd produced exactly the kind of psychological damage that made future precision harder. Trembling hands, disrupted sleep, a flinch reflex that appeared at the worst possible moment, in the backswing, just before the blade reached the target. Accounts suggest that some executioners developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress, a condition that manifests in exactly the physical symptoms most incompatible with a job requiring absolute steadiness under extreme pressure. The executioner who needed a drink before stepping onto the scaffold was not being unprofessional. He was self-medicating for a condition that nobody in his century had a name for, using the only tool available to him, and that tool made his hands steadier in the short term and less reliable in the long term, which is a trap so perfectly designed it almost seems intentional. Some executioners lived their entire careers without a single botched execution. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, whose diary we will visit later tonight, recorded 361 executions across a career spanning more than 4 decades, and the surviving evidence suggests his record was remarkably clean. He was a professional of exceptional discipline. But Schmidt was exceptional precisely because consistency over that many executions was so rare. Most executioners performed far fewer killings across shorter careers, and the statistical likelihood of a problem, a condemned who moved, a sword that slipped, a moment of hesitation that cost a fraction of a second, increased with every execution. The career of an executioner was a long, slow accumulation of pressure, each successful execution adding one more weight to the pile, each weight making the next execution marginally harder to face, with steady hands and an empty mind. And after the killing was done, the work continued. The body had to be dealt with. In most jurisdictions, the executioner was responsible for removing the body from the scaffold and disposing of it. For executed criminals, burial in consecrated ground was typically denied. The body might be buried in unconsecrated ground outside the city, in a designated area that served as the final extension of the executioner's social territory, a patch of earth as marginal and stigmatized as the executioner's own house. In cases of particularly serious crimes, the body might be displayed as a warning, left on the gallows or the wheel for days or weeks, until weather and scavenging animals had made their contribution to the public message. The executioner maintained these displays. He checked the ropes. He dealt with what remained when the display period ended. The glamorous part of his job, if any part of this job could be called glamorous, lasted minutes. The unglamorous aftermath lasted hours or days. Then he went home. He walked back to the house outside the city walls, past the neighbors who had watched the procession from their windows, past the market where the broadsheet sellers were already packaging the event into a story that would travel to other towns. He cleaned his tools. He stored his sword. He washed the smell of the scaffold from his clothes, or tried to. And he sat in his kitchen and ate his meal and waited for the next piece of paper from the court, which might come tomorrow or might not come for months. And in the months between, He would fill his time doing the work that paid the bills when nobody needed killing, collecting dead animals, disposing of carcasses, rendering fat, cleaning the city's drainage ditches. In some jurisdictions, because the job description for a medieval executioner was less a list of duties and more a catch-all category for every task that honorable citizens refused to perform. The fee for the execution itself would arrive eventually. It was not paid on the spot. It was processed through the city's accounting system, which meant paperwork, approval, and delay. The amount was fixed by local custom or civic ordinance, not by negotiation, so you could not charge more for a difficult execution or less for a simple one. The fee was the fee. Whether you earned it with a single perfect stroke or with 3 panicked swings while the crowd threw rocks at you, the payment was the same. Merit had no market value, only completion. The crowd dispersed, the broadsheets circulated, the priests recorded the death in their registers, the court moved on to the next case, and the executioner went back to the yard behind his house and sharpened the blade, because the blade always needed sharpening, and because sharpening was the one part of his job that was entirely within his control, a small, precise, meditative act that required nothing from anyone else and answered to no crowd and carried no risk of failure. Just steel and stone and the quiet, repetitive motion of a man preparing for something he hoped would not happen soon, but knew would happen eventually. The scaffold waited. It always waited, and so did you. Of course, the real question underneath all of this, the question that a modern person cannot help asking, after watching the procession and the scaffold and the crowd and the cleanup, is whether any of it was worth it financially, whether the money made the misery tolerable, whether the executioner's purse, at least, offered some compensation for everything his social standing denied him, and the answer is complicated in exactly the way you would expect from a profession where nothing was ever simple. Let us walk through the money, all of it, every source, every fee, every strange and sometimes disturbing side income, because the economics of being a medieval executioner were not a single salary paid on a predictable schedule. They were a patchwork, a dozen different revenue streams stitched together into something that might, in a good year, add up to a decent living, and in a bad year, might leave you choosing between sharpening your sword and feeding your children. The execution fee was the most visible income. It was set by civic ordinance, recorded in city account books, and paid through official channels, and it varied enormously, depending on where you worked and what method the court specified. In many German cities during the 14th and 15th centuries, a beheading by sword paid more than a hanging. The logic, insofar as there was logic, seemed to follow a hierarchy of skill. A sword beheading required more expertise, carried more risk of failure, and was considered the more honorable method of death, which meant the executioner was compensated for the additional difficulty. A hanging, while still requiring knowledge of rope length and drop calculation, was seen as less technically demanding, and therefore attracted a lower fee. Breaking on the wheel paid more again, because the process was longer, more physically taxing, and more psychologically grueling for everyone involved, including the executioner. The specific amounts are documented in surviving fee schedules from several cities, and when you translate them into labor equivalents, the picture becomes concrete. A beheading in a mid-sized German city in the 1500s might earn the executioner somewhere between 1 and 3 gulden, depending on the city and the period. A skilled carpenter in the same city and period earned roughly 1 gulden per month, so a single beheading might represent 1 to 3 months of a carpenter's wages, which sounds generous until you remember that a mid-sized city might only order a handful of executions per year. In a slow year, 1 or 2. In a busy year, perhaps 6 or 8. If your entire income depended on execution fees, you would earn the equivalent of a few months of skilled labor spread across an entire year. You would, in purely financial terms, be poor. But execution fees were not the only source of income tied to the scaffold. Torture fees were separate. When the court ordered judicial torture as part of an interrogation, the executioner was paid for each session. A single interrogation might involve multiple applications of different techniques across several days, and each application carried its own fee. The thumbscrew had a price. The strappado had a price. Each escalation in the severity of the questioning came with its own line item on the invoice that the executioner submitted to the city treasury. Torture, in financial terms, was more reliable than execution because it happened more frequently. Courts ordered torture far more often than they ordered death, which meant the executioner's income from the interrogation chamber could exceed his income from the scaffold in any given year. The man who killed for the state earned more money from hurting people than from killing them. The incentive structure, if you pause to think about it, is quietly horrifying. Then there were the supplementary civic duties. Animal carcass disposal was, for many executioners, the single most consistent source of income. It was unglamorous, physically repulsive, and essential. Dead horses, cattle, pigs, and dogs had to be collected from the streets, fields, and stables of the city and brought to the knacker's yard for processing. The executioner was often the designated collector, either by specific civic appointment or by default because nobody else was willing to do it. The fee for each carcass was small, but carcasses were frequent. Animals died regularly in a medieval city. Horses collapsed in the streets from overwork. Cattle fell to disease. Stray dogs were killed by the city watch. Each dead animal represented a few pennies, and a few pennies collected consistently across every week of the year added up to a baseline income that execution fees alone could never provide. It was the reliable floor beneath the irregular ceiling. Animal rendering produced secondary income as well. The fat from rendered carcasses could be sold for candle making and soap production. Hides could be sold to the tanners, who were fellow members of the dishonorable trades and therefore willing to do business without the social complications that an honorable merchant might raise. Bones could be ground for fertilizer or sold to craftsmen who worked in bone. The knacker's yard was, in effect, a small industrial operation, and the executioner, who ran it efficiently, could extract meaningful value from materials that the rest of the city considered waste. And then there was the income that nobody talked about openly, but everybody knew existed: the trade in human remains. Human fat, rendered from the bodies of executed criminals, was believed by a significant portion of the medieval and early modern population to possess medicinal or even magical properties. Ointments containing human fat were sold as treatments for joint pain, skin conditions, and wounds. Candles made from human tallow were believed to have protective or curative powers. The demand was real. The supply was controlled entirely by one person. The executioner had a monopoly on a product that his customers desperately wanted and could not obtain from any other source, and he exploited that monopoly with the quiet, unsentimental efficiency of a man who understood that the market cared about results, not about the process that produced them. Blood was another commodity. The blood of executed criminals, collected at the scaffold, was believed in several regions to cure epilepsy. People suffering from the condition, or their families, would approach the executioner before or after an execution and negotiate for a quantity of blood. The price was set by the executioner, not by any civic authority, because this was a private transaction operating in the shadow of the official economy. The blood was fresh, the demand was desperate, and the executioner, the only person in the city who had legal access to a reliable supply of freshly shed human blood, was in a position to name his price. Other body parts found buyers in the same discreet, unregulated market. Skin, in rare cases, was tanned and sold. Fingers and toes were sold as charms or as ingredients in folk remedies. The specific items and the specific beliefs attached to them varied by region and by century. but the underlying economic reality was consistent. The executioner's access to human remains gave him a source of income that was invisible to the city's official accounting, untaxed, and entirely dependent on the persistence of beliefs that the church officially discouraged but could not eliminate. The folk medicine market was the executioner's black economy, and in some documented cases, it was his most profitable one. There was also the tradition known in some jurisdictions as the right of the executioner to claim certain items from the condemned or from the execution itself. The clothing of the condemned in some cities became the executioner's property. Items found on the condemned's person could be claimed. Even elements of the scaffold apparatus, worn rope or damaged timber, could be salvaged and sold. These were small amounts. Individually, none of them would sustain a family. But layered on top of the execution fees, and the torture fees, and the carcass disposal income, and the rendering profits, and the black market in human remains, they contributed to a total income picture that was, for some executioners in some cities, genuinely comfortable. And this is where the status flip becomes most painfully visible. A successful executioner in a major city, a man who managed his various income streams with discipline, who rendered his animals efficiently, who maintained his monopoly on the human remains trade, who submitted his invoices on time and collected his fees without complaint, could accumulate wealth that exceeded what many honorable tradesmen earned. He could own furniture. He could eat meat regularly. He could afford decent clothing, though he could not always wear it in public without attracting the wrong kind of attention. He could, in purely material terms, live better than the carpenter who earned half his income, but drank in taverns the executioner could not enter. But a bad year could undo all of it. A stretch of low crime meant few executions and fewer torture sessions. A livestock plague that killed most of the city's animals before they could die naturally meant fewer carcasses to collect and render. An economic downturn that reduced the population's willingness to spend money on folk remedies made from human fat meant the black market income dried up. The executioner had no guild to protect him, no collective bargaining power, no formal mechanism for negotiating better terms. He was a sole contractor in a market he did not control, dependent on variables that ranged from the crime rate to the weather to the price of candle wax. The city council set his fees. The courts determined his workload. The marketplace determined the value of his secondary products. The executioner determined nothing except how carefully he sharpened his sword and how efficiently he ran his knacker's yard. The total picture, when you step back and look at it, is a man earning money from death, from pain, from dead animals, from human body parts, from whatever scraps the condemned left behind, from the drainage ditches and the filthy tasks that honorable citizens would not touch. Every coin he earned came from something that society considered contaminating. His income was drawn entirely from the dishonorable economy, the shadow economy, the economy of last resort. And the irony, the one that the city council never acknowledged, and probably never even noticed, was that this economy existed because the honorable economy had no room for him. The guilds would not admit him. The trades would not train his sons. The taverns would not serve him. So he built his own economy out of the materials available to him, which were death and dead things, and the fear and superstition that surrounded both. The Lord collected fines from the convicted. The court collected processing fees for each case. The church collected donations for the condemned soul, offered prayers at a price, and sold indulgences that promised reduced suffering in the afterlife. Every institution in the chain between the crime and the killing extracted its share. The magistrate was paid, the clerk was paid, the priest was paid, the guards were paid, and at the very end of the chain, at the point where the paperwork became a body and the sentence became a death, the executioner received his fee, the smallest share. Paid last, processed slowest, delivered with the minimum of ceremony to a man the city could not function without and could not bring itself to treat as a participant in the system he served. That is the economics of death in a medieval city. A patchwork income assembled from a dozen sources, each one stained with the same dishonor that stained everything the executioner touched. The money was real, the coins spent the same as any other coins, but the hands that held them were unclean, and no amount of silver could wash them. And those same unclean hands, as it turns out, could heal. We touched on this at the very beginning of tonight, in the first words of the hook, but now it is time to sit with it properly, because the executioner's medical practice was not a footnote or a curiosity. For many executioner families, it was the most meaningful thing they did, the thing that gave purpose to knowledge, gained in the most terrible way imaginable, the thing that turned a lifetime of cutting and breaking and burning into something that occasionally, quietly, looked like mercy. The knowledge base was simple to explain and uncomfortable to think about. An executioner who had performed dozens or hundreds of executions and dozens or hundreds of torture sessions had, by default, acquired an intimate, hands-on understanding of human anatomy that no other person in the medieval city could match. He knew where the major blood vessels ran because he had severed them. He knew how joints articulated because he had dislocated them. He knew how bones broke and at what angle and with how much force, because breaking bones was, in some cases, literally his job description. He knew which wounds bled heavily and which did not. He knew how the body responded to trauma, how shock presented, how pain manifested in the muscles and the breathing and the eyes. None of this knowledge came from books. None of it came from lectures at a university. It came from direct, repeated, physical experience with the interior of the human body, acquired under circumstances that nobody else was willing to replicate. Compare this to the university-trained physician of the same period. The physician had read Galen. He had studied the theory of the four humors. He understood, in abstract terms, how the body was believed to work according to a model that was largely incorrect but impressively systematic. He could discuss the qualities of hot and cold, wet and dry, and prescribe treatments based on a conceptual framework that had more in common with philosophy than with biology. What he had almost certainly never done was open a human body and look inside. Dissection was rare, controversial, and when it occurred, was typically performed on the bodies of executed criminals. Which brings us full circle to the executioner standing in the room. The physician learned anatomy from a book. The executioner learned anatomy from the scaffold. The physician's knowledge was theoretical, comprehensive, and often wrong. The executioner's knowledge was practical, specific, and grounded in what he had actually seen with his own eyes and felt with his own hands. The result was predictable. For many common medical problems, the executioner was simply better at treating them than the physician was. Broken bones, dislocated joints, deep wounds, skin conditions, chronic pain. The executioner had seen these injuries from the inside. He knew what a properly set bone felt like because he knew what an improperly broken bone felt like. He could reduce a dislocated shoulder because he had caused dislocated shoulders and understood the mechanics of the joint in a way that no amount of reading about humoral theory could provide. He also had access to a pharmacopoeia that overlapped with the physician's in some areas and diverged sharply in others. Herbal remedies were part of the executioner's toolkit because many of the same herbs used to ease pain in patients had originally been used to ease pain in the condemned. If you knew which plants reduce suffering on the scaffold, you knew which plants reduce suffering in a sickbed. The crossover was direct and practical. Beyond herbs, the executioner had access to the folk remedies derived from human remains, the fat ointments, the blood cures, the bone preparations that a significant portion of the population believed in, with a conviction that no physician's skepticism could shake. Whether these remedies actually worked is a question modern medicine answers firmly in the negative. Whether the patients believed they worked is a question the historical record answers firmly in the affirmative. And belief, in an era before controlled trials and evidence-based medicine, was the only metric that mattered. The social mechanics of accessing the executioner's medical services were an elaborate, almost comical exercise in collective denial. The patient could not be seen visiting the executioner's house. Being seen there would raise questions about why you were associating with a dishonorable person, and those questions could damage your reputation, your guild standing, and your family's social position. So the visits happened at night, through the back door, in plain clothing that did not identify the patient's trade or status. Payment was in cash, because cash left no paper trail, or in kind, food, cloth, small goods that could be exchanged without a record. The patient came in shame, was treated in secrecy, and left in silence, hoping nobody had seen them. And then, presumably, they went home and enjoyed the use of their newly set bone or their freshly stitched wound without ever mentioning who had done the setting or the stitching. The Physicians' Guild, when it became aware of the executioner's medical practice, reacted with exactly the outrage you would expect from a professional cartel discovering that an unlicensed competitor was stealing its customers. The executioner had no medical training in the formal sense. He had no guild certification. He had no right, in the guild's view, to practice medicine. The fact that his treatments often worked better than the guild physician's treatments was not considered relevant to the discussion, because the discussion was about credentials, not outcomes. The guild filed complaints. The city council sometimes intervened, sometimes did not. The executioner continued treating patients, because the patients kept coming, and the patients kept coming, because the executioner kept fixing them, and the executioner kept fixing them because he knew things about the human body that no amount of Galen could teach. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg eventually transitioned from executioner to recognized medical practitioner after his retirement from the scaffold. His case is the most fully documented example, but he was not unique. Across the German-speaking world, executioners quietly built medical reputations that persisted alongside and sometimes outlasted their reputations as killers. The healer and the killer were the same man. The hands that set bones on Thursday had swung the sword on Tuesday. The knowledge that saved a child's dislocated elbow had been acquired by dislocating an adult's shoulders in a torture chamber. The patients knew this. They came anyway. Because when your arm is broken, and the physician wants to balance your humors, and the executioner wants to set the bone, you go to the man who can fix the arm. Stigma bends in the presence of pain. It does not break, but it bends. It is a pattern that repeats with almost mechanical consistency across every century. People will seek the cure while despising the source. They will use the product while condemning the producer. They will benefit from the knowledge while refusing to acknowledge how the knowledge was gained. The executioner's medical practice was not an anomaly in the history of medicine. It was a preview of a dynamic that would play out again and again in anatomy theaters and surgical wards and research laboratories, wherever the knowledge that saves lives was acquired through acts that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. The executioner knew this. He may not have articulated it in those terms, but he understood the transaction. He healed because he could. He was paid because people needed him, and he was despised because the same hands that healed had also killed, and society could not forgive the killing even when it benefited from the healing. The contradiction lived in his hands every single day. The hands that sharpened the sword in the morning set a bone in the evening. The hands that collected a carcass fee at noon applied an ointment at midnight. The hands were the same. The world insisted they were different. The contradiction lived in his hands, but it lived in his house as well, because the executioner did not carry the weight of this profession alone. He carried it home with him every evening, through the back door, into a kitchen where his wife was preparing a meal, and his children were doing whatever children do when their father's occupation has made the entire concept of normal childhood a theoretical exercise. The executioner's wife is one of the most invisible figures in medieval social history. She appears in the records only at the edges. A name in a marriage register, a mention in a petition, an occasional note in a city council minute when the council debated whether the executioner's household was entitled to some benefit or exemption. She almost never speaks in her own voice. What we know about her comes from the shape of the silence around her, from the outlines of a life that can be reconstructed from the duties she must have performed and the restrictions she must have endured. She married into the profession knowing what it meant. Or rather, she married into the profession because her own family already knew what it meant, because the marriage restrictions that governed the executioner's world meant she was almost certainly the daughter of another dishonorable tradesman, a knacker's daughter, a tanner's daughter, a gravedigger's daughter. In the best cases, the daughter of another executioner from another city, a match arranged through the network of executioner families that stretched across the German-speaking world like an underground root system, connecting households that respectable society had decided should not exist. She did not marry for love in the modern romantic sense, though love may have followed. She married because the mathematics of the dishonorable marriage pool left her with a limited selection of candidates, and the executioner's son, or the executioner himself, was among them, and the alternative was not marrying at all, which, in a medieval context, meant a lifetime of dependency without the legal protections that marriage provided. Once married, she entered a household that functioned as a small, self-contained economy. She managed the domestic operations. She cooked, cleaned, maintained the house, raised the children, and handled the social interactions that the executioner himself could not always manage because his presence in certain spaces was forbidden or dangerous. She bought food at the market, navigating the particular kind of transaction where the seller serves you because your money is as good as anyone's, but makes it clear through speed, minimal eye contact, and the absence of small talk that you are not a customer they wish to linger with. She may have assisted with the medical practice, preparing herbal remedies, managing the supply of ointments, greeting patients at the back door during the evening hours when the consultations happened. In some documented cases, the executioner's wife provided medical treatment herself, particularly for women and children who were uncomfortable being examined by a male practitioner. She was, in these cases, an unlicensed female healer, operating inside the household of an unlicensed male healer, both of them practicing a medicine that the Physicians' Guild considered illegal and the patients considered effective. She also lived with the smell. This is a detail that the records do not dwell on, but that must have been a constant, defining feature of daily life in the executioner's household: the rendering of animal carcasses, the storage of tools that had been used on human bodies and cleaned but never entirely freed of what they had touched, the herbs and chemicals used in the medical practice, the particular, unmistakable smell of a house that sat near the knacker's yard and served as the operating base for a profession built on death and dead things. The house itself might have been structurally sound, well built, even comfortable by the standards of its era, but it smelled like what it was, and the smell was another wall, invisible but impassable, between the executioner's family and the neighbors who lived upwind. The children grew up inside this wall. They grew up knowing they were different before they understood why. They grew up watching their mother navigate the market with quiet dignity and zero warmth from the people around her. They grew up watching their father leave the house with his tools and return with the particular silence that followed a day on the scaffold. They grew up playing in a yard that was, depending on the city and the period, adjacent to or part of the knacker's operation, which meant that the background landscape of their childhood included animal carcasses in various stages of processing. This was not trauma in the way a modern person might define it. It was normal. It was the only normal they had. The trauma was not inside the house. The trauma was outside it, in the world that had decided they did not belong. The sons had a path, grim and narrow, but at least defined. They would learn their father's trade. They would practice on gourds and straw bundles and pig carcasses. They would eventually step onto the scaffold and become the next generation of a dynasty that nobody envied but everybody required. The path was terrible, but it was a path. The daughters had something worse. They had a question mark. A daughter born into an executioner's family in the 14th or 15th century faced a future constrained by mathematics that no amount of cleverness or beauty or determination could overcome. She could marry within the dishonorable trades. She could marry the knacker's son, the tanner's son, the gravedigger's son, or an executioner's son from another city. The pool was tiny. The geography was wide. Finding a suitable match might require correspondence and negotiation across dozens of miles, conducted through the informal network of dishonorable families that functioned as the only social infrastructure available to people the formal social infrastructure had excluded. A successful match meant leaving home, leaving the city where she had grown up, leaving whatever fragile social connections she had managed to build within the dishonorable community, and moving to another city to begin the same life in a different house outside different city walls. An unsuccessful match meant not marrying, and in some cases, the match was simply not there. The dishonorable population in a given region might not include a man of appropriate age and circumstances. The executioner's daughter might wait and wait. And eventually, the records show what waiting looked like, because civic archives are unintentionally precise in the stories they tell through absence. A family appears in the marriage registers for 3 generations. Marriages recorded, children baptized, a continuous thread of documented existence. Then the thread stops. No marriage recorded for the daughter. No baptism recorded for the next generation. The family name appears on a payroll 1 decade and does not appear the next. Nobody wrote down what happened. Nobody needed to. The silence in the record is the story. A family that ran out of options and quietly ceased to exist. There are documented cases of executioners' daughters who attempted to marry outside the dishonorable trades, and the records of these attempts read like case studies in institutional cruelty administered with bureaucratic calm. The daughter finds a young man from an honorable trade. The young man, presumably, cares enough about her to risk what comes next. They petition for permission to marry. The guild to which the young man belongs objects. The guild argues that the marriage will contaminate the young man's family with the dishonorable classification, that his children will be unable to apprentice in the trade, that the guild's reputation will be damaged by the association. The city council considers the petition. In most documented cases, the council sides with the guild. The marriage is denied, or, if it proceeds despite the objection, the young man is expelled from his guild, which means he loses his trade, his income, his professional identity, and his place in the honorable world. He has, in effect, chosen love over livelihood. The choice is real, the consequences are permanent, and the system that imposed those consequences did not lose a moment's sleep over the wreckage it created. In rare cases, the petition succeeded. An executioner with enough influence, enough wealth, enough accumulated goodwill from the city council could sometimes secure a dispensation for a daughter's marriage. But these were exceptional outcomes, produced by exceptional circumstances, and they did not change the system. They simply demonstrated that the system could be bypassed by individuals with enough leverage, which is a pattern so common in the history of institutional injustice that it barely needs stating. The rule applied to everyone. The exceptions applied to the fortunate few, and the existence of exceptions allowed the system to present itself as reasonable, while remaining, for the vast majority of people inside it, completely implacable. And beneath all of this, beneath the social isolation and the marriage restrictions and the invisible walls and the smell of the knacker's yard, there was a question that the executioner's family lived with every day but almost never spoke about aloud, the question of the soul. The church's official position on the executioner's spiritual status was more complicated and more lenient than most people assume. This is one of the comfortable lies that deserves to be examined carefully. because the popular version of the story, the version where the church condemned the executioner as a damned soul doing the devil's work, is not quite right. And the reality, as usual, is both more interesting and more unsettling than the myth. The theological framework that governed lawful killing had been worked out centuries before the executioner's profession was formalized. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, had argued that killing in service of lawful authority was not a sin. A soldier who killed in a just war was not a murderer. A magistrate who ordered an execution was not guilty of homicide. The killing was sanctioned by the authority of the state, and the authority of the state was, in Augustine's framework, derived from the authority of God. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, refined this position further. Lawful execution was not merely permissible, but could be a positive good, a necessary act to protect the common welfare by removing individuals whose continued existence threatened the social order. The executioner, in Aquinas' framework, was an instrument of that good. He did not bear the moral weight of the killing, because the moral responsibility resided in the authority that ordered it. This was the theory. It was clear, it was systematic, and it was available to any executioner who wanted to read it, which, given the literacy rates of the period, most could not. But even the executioners who had the theory explained to them by a sympathetic priest or a philosophically inclined magistrate lived inside a reality that the theory could not touch. Because the theory lived in treatises and lecture halls and theological libraries, the executioner lived in a city where the people around him behaved as though his soul was in constant, active danger, regardless of what Augustine or Aquinas had written 300 or 800 years earlier. The separate church pew, the whispered prayers, the way certain priests treated the executioner with a wariness that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with the visceral, animal discomfort of standing next to a man who had killed dozens of people with his hands. The question of burial in consecrated ground, which varied by jurisdiction and by period, but which, in the asking, revealed that somebody, somewhere, was not entirely convinced that the executioner's soul was safe. The executioner's obligation to pray with the condemned before every execution, a ritual that placed him in the position of spiritual comforter to a person he was about to kill, a role that required him to ask God for mercy on behalf of someone he was about to deprive of the one thing God had given them that could not be replaced. The gap between what the church taught and what the community practiced was the air the executioner breathed every Sunday. The church said his soul was not in danger. The community said his hands were stained. The church said he was an instrument of divine justice. The community said he was something they preferred not to sit next to. The church said killing on behalf of lawful authority was not a sin. The community said there was a reason his house was outside the walls, and the executioner himself. What did he believe? The records offer glimpses, but not answers. Franz Schmidt's diary, which we will come to soon, contains entries that suggest a man who thought carefully about the moral weight of his work. Other executioners left no written record of their inner lives, which means we are left to guess from the external evidence. The drinking before executions, the tremors, the requests for priestly counsel that appear in scattered church records across the German-speaking world, the petitions for honorable status that, in their urgency and their repetition, suggest men who were not entirely at peace with the theological reassurances they had been offered. If you truly believed your soul was safe, would you spend decades petitioning for a piece of paper that said you were honorable? If you truly believed Augustine and Aquinas, would you need a priest to tell you again and again and again that the killing was not your burden to carry? The answer, for most executioners, was probably something quieter and sadder than either certainty or despair. It was probably doubt, the low, persistent, unresolvable kind of doubt that lives in the background of a life and never quite goes away, and never quite becomes a crisis. The kind of doubt that lets you do the work on Tuesday, and pray on Sunday, and sharpen the blade on Wednesday, and lie awake on Thursday, wondering whether the prayer and the blade can coexist in the same pair of hands. The church said they could. The community said they could not. And the executioner lay in his bed, in his house, outside the walls, and listened to the silence, and did not know which voice to believe. The night gets softer here. The questions get quieter. And the story begins to settle into the lives of specific people, real people, who carried these contradictions inside them for entire lifetimes, and left behind just enough evidence for us to know they were there. There is a relationship that nobody ever talks about when they talk about execution, not the relationship between the executioner and the court, not the relationship between the executioner and the crowd, the relationship between the executioner and the condemned, because these two people, who were brought together by a system that treated both of them as instruments rather than as human beings, spent hours together before the killing happened, sometimes days. And in that time, something occurred between them that was not friendship, and not enmity, and not quite anything that has a comfortable name. The executioner, in many jurisdictions, was the last person the condemned spoke to at length. The priest came and went. The magistrate delivered the sentence and departed. The guards changed shifts and rotated out, but the executioner was there at the end, present in the cell during the final hours, present during the last meal, present during the walk to the scaffold, present at the moment of death, and present afterward when the body had to be dealt with and everybody else had gone home. He was, in a sense, the most faithful companion the condemned had in the final chapter of their life, the person who stayed when everyone else had somewhere better to be, the person who would remember the condemned's face long after the crowd had forgotten the condemned's name. Years later, sharpening a blade in his yard on a quiet afternoon, the executioner might suddenly recall the way a particular condemned person had looked at him in the cell, and the memory would arrive without warning and without context, just a face and a silence, surfacing from the place where all the faces and all the silences were stored. This proximity created something, not tenderness necessarily, but familiarity. The executioner learned things about the condemned that nobody else knew or cared to know. He learned whether they were afraid or calm, whether they prayed with conviction or repeated words out of habit, whether they ate their last meal with appetite or pushed the food around the plate with the distracted indifference of someone who has realized that hunger no longer matters. He learned the particular sound of a person's breathing when they have accepted that the morning will not arrive, and the different sound of a person's breathing when they have not accepted it and are holding on to hope with the desperate, unreasonable grip of someone who knows the grip will fail but cannot bring themselves to let go. The condemned, for their part, learned something about the executioner too. They learned whether his hands were steady. They learned whether his voice was kind or merely professional. They learned whether the man who was about to end their life regarded them as a person or as a task. And in the records that survive, scattered across confessional accounts and court depositions, and the margins of execution reports, there are fragments that suggest the condemned sometimes came to a strange, exhausted peace with the executioner precisely because the executioner was the one person in the entire process who was not pretending. The judge pretended the sentence was impersonal. The priest pretended that spiritual comfort could make the killing bearable. The crowd pretended they were witnessing justice rather than enjoying spectacle. The executioner pretended nothing. He was the man who was going to kill you. He said so. He asked your forgiveness for it. And in that honesty, terrible as it was, there was something the condemned could lean against, a surface that did not shift. Some executioners developed what might be called a practice of care within the mechanics of their duty. They learned how to speak to the condemned in the final hours in a way that reduced panic. They learned which words helped and which words made things worse. They learned that a condemned person who was calm at the scaffold was a condemned person whose neck remained still at the moment of the stroke, and a condemned person who was terrified was a condemned person who flinched, and a flinch at the wrong moment was the difference between a clean death and a catastrophe. The executioner's kindness, in the cases where kindness existed, was therefore both genuine and strategic. Being humane to the condemned made the killing easier. Reducing their fear reduced the risk. Compassion and professional self-interest pointed in the same direction, and whether the executioner was motivated by one or the other or both is a question that probably does not have a single answer. It is also a question that the executioner himself may not have been able to answer. When you calm a frightened person in their last hour, are you being kind or are you preparing your workspace? When you hold their hand during the prayer and feel their pulse slowing as the panic recedes, is that mercy or technique? The line between the two had been erased so many times across so many executions that it may have stopped existing entirely. There were cases where the relationship between executioner and condemned became complicated enough to leave traces in the official record. Cases where the executioner petitioned the court for clemency on behalf of a condemned person he believed had been unjustly sentenced. These petitions were rare, they were almost never successful, and they carried enormous professional risk, because an executioner who questioned the court's judgment was an executioner who had forgotten his place in the system, and the system did not appreciate being questioned by its instruments. But the petitions exist, they are documented, and their existence suggests that some executioners, despite every incentive to remain detached, despite the professional necessity of treating each condemned person as a task rather than as a human being, could not always maintain that detachment. Something in the hours spent together, in the prayers said side by side, in the small intimacies of a shared meal and a shared silence, broke through the professional barrier and reached the human being underneath. The reverse also occurred. There were condemned persons who directed their final anger not at the court or the system, but at the executioner personally, who cursed him on the scaffold, who spat at him, who used their last words, the only uncensorable speech available to a person the law had decided to kill, to tell the executioner that he was damned, that his children were damned, that every generation of his family would carry the stain of what he had done. These outbursts were recorded because they were public, because the crowd heard them, and because the broadsheet sellers recognized good copy when they heard it. The executioner absorbed these curses the way he absorbed everything else the profession delivered to him, silently, professionally, with the practiced stillness of a man who had learned that reacting to provocation on the scaffold only made the crowd louder and the job harder. He could not argue. He could not defend himself. He could not explain that the killing was the court's decision and not his. He could only stand there and let the words land, and then do the thing the words were about. And then he swung the sword. But imagine, just for a moment, carrying those words home with you. The curse of a dying person is not the same as the curse of a living one. There is a weight to final words that ordinary speech does not carry, a gravity that comes from the knowledge that the speaker will never speak again, and that these particular words, chosen in the last minutes of consciousness, were selected from everything the person could have said and deemed important enough to spend their final breath on. The executioner who was cursed on the scaffold went home to his kitchen and sat with his wife and ate his dinner with those words still echoing. He went to church on Sunday and knelt in his separate pew with those words still echoing. He lay in bed and listened to the silence of his house outside the city walls and wondered whether a dying person's curse had power that a living person's curse did not. The church would say no, the community would say maybe, and the executioner, lying in the dark, would not know which answer to believe. There is a detail that appears in scattered records across the German-speaking world that captures the strangeness of this relationship better than anything else. In some jurisdictions, if the executioner and the condemned had established a rapport during the final hours, the condemned would sometimes give the executioner a small personal item before the walk to the scaffold: a ring, a button, a coin, a scrap of cloth, nothing valuable, just something that belonged to them, something they wanted someone to have after they were gone. And the executioner, the man who in a few minutes would kill them, accepted the gift and kept it. Some executioners accumulated small collections of these items over the course of their careers. Objects given to them by people they had subsequently killed, stored in a box or a drawer in the house outside the walls, each one a memorial to a person who no longer existed, and a moment of connection that the system was designed to prevent, but could not entirely suppress. What do you do with a box like that? What do you call the feeling you have when you open it on a quiet evening and hold a stranger's ring in your hands, and remember the morning you swung the sword and the ring's owner stopped existing? You remember their voice. You remember whether they trembled or stood still. You remember the sound the crowd made, and the way the light fell, and the weight of the blade in your hands at the top of the arc. Grief is not the right word. Guilt is not the right word either. There is no word for it, which is perhaps why the executioners who kept these items never wrote about them. The objects appear in estate inventories and household records after the executioner's death, catalogued by clerks who noted their existence without understanding their significance. A small ring, origin unknown, a brass button, no apparent value. The clerk moved on to the next item. The story behind the object went unrecorded, because the story belonged to two people, and one of them was dead, and the other was the kind of person whose inner life nobody thought was worth preserving. The condemned and the executioner needed each other in a way that neither of them would have chosen, and neither of them could escape. The condemned needed the executioner to be skilled, to be steady, to end it quickly and cleanly. The executioner needed the condemned to be still, to be calm, to hold their neck in position for the fraction of a second that the swing required. Each of them depended on the other for the thing they feared most. The condemned depended on the executioner for a good death. The executioner depended on the condemned for a clean stroke. And in that mutual dependency, in that shared moment on the scaffold, when both of their lives balanced on the edge of the same blade, they were more connected to each other than either of them was to anyone else, in the crowd, or the court, or the city. Two people, alone together, at the center of a system that used them both and thanked neither. The scaffold was the loneliest place in any medieval city. Surrounded by hundreds of people, watched by the entire civic apparatus, blessed by the church, authorized by the court, documented by the clerks. And the two loneliest people on it were standing next to each other, bound together by a duty that neither of them had chosen, separated by a blade that was about to fall. And now, finally, we come to the man who wrote it down. His name was Franz Schmidt. Remember it, he was born in 1554 in the city of Hof, in the region of Franconia, in the northern part of what is now Bavaria. His father, Heinrich Schmidt, was the executioner of Hof, and Franz grew up inside the world we have been walking through tonight. The house outside the walls, the separate pew, the children who did not play with him, the mother who navigated the market with quiet efficiency and received no warmth in return, the smell of the knacker's yard, the sound of a blade being sharpened in the early morning, all of it. Every detail we have described tonight was the texture of Franz Schmidt's childhood, and he lived inside that texture for his entire youth, without any indication that he found it remarkable, because he had nothing to compare it to. This was normal. This was what life was. The strangeness of it only becomes visible from the outside, and Franz Schmidt spent the first decades of his life firmly on the inside. His father had not chosen the profession. This is an important detail, and Schmidt himself considered it the central injustice of his family's story. Heinrich Schmidt had been a woodsman, an honorable trade, a life lived among trees and timber, with no connection to the scaffold. But at some point in the middle of the 16th century, a local nobleman compelled Heinrich to perform an execution when no executioner was available. The details are sparse. What is clear is that the act was coerced, not volunteered, and that it destroyed Heinrich's honorable status permanently. One killing, performed under duress, transformed Heinrich Schmidt from a woodsman into an executioner, and the transformation was irreversible. He could not go back to the forest. The guilds would not readmit him. The only work available to him now was the work that had contaminated him in the first place. And so, Heinrich became an executioner, and his son Franz was born into the profession not because of any family tradition stretching back generations, but because of a single act of aristocratic compulsion that had rewritten his father's entire identity. Franz Schmidt grew up knowing this. He grew up knowing that his family's dishonor was not inherited from some ancient lineage of scaffold workers, but manufactured, in a single afternoon, by a nobleman who needed someone killed and did not particularly care whose life he ruined in the process. That knowledge shaped everything Schmidt did for the rest of his life. He began his apprenticeship the way every executioner's son began it. Practice on gourds and straw bundles in the yard behind the house, then animal carcasses, then the long, patient process of learning the swing, the arc, the follow-through, the way the blade moved through resistance, the way the shoulders absorbed the shock. His father taught him the way his father's father had taught his father. The curriculum was the body, the textbook was the scaffold, and the final exam was a living person kneeling in front of you with their neck exposed and the crowd watching, and God, presumably, watching too. Franz Schmidt performed his first execution in 1573. He was 19 years old. The condemned was a man convicted of theft. Schmidt used the sword. The record does not say whether the stroke was clean, but the absence of any note about failure suggests it was. A botched execution would have been recorded, because botched executions were events, disruptions, civic embarrassments that generated paperwork. A clean execution generated nothing except a brief entry in a ledger. Success, in this profession, was silence. And then Franz Schmidt did something that no other executioner of his era did, or at least no other executioner whose work has survived. He started keeping a diary. The diary is not a confessional. It is not a memoir in the modern sense. It is not a document designed to make the reader feel something about Franz Schmidt's inner life. It is a professional record, a log, an accounting of every execution and every major punishment he performed across a career that would eventually span more than 4 decades. The entries are brief, precise, and almost entirely devoid of emotional commentary. A name, a crime, a method, a date, occasionally a detail about the condemned's behavior or the circumstances of the crime that caught Schmidt's attention, but no feelings, no reflections on the morality of the work, no confessions of doubt or anguish or satisfaction. The diary reads like the record of a man who has decided that the facts are enough, that the simple act of writing down what happened, who died, and how they died, is itself a kind of statement that does not need to be decorated with sentiment. And yet, there are cracks in the professional surface, not large ones, not dramatic outpourings of guilt or grief, but small, quiet moments where something other than professional detachment seems to be operating. A note about a condemned woman who went to the scaffold with particular courage, a detail about a young man whose crime seemed, in Schmidt's telling, disproportionate to his sentence. An entry where the description of the crime is slightly longer than necessary, slightly more detailed than the format requires, as though Schmidt wanted the reader, whoever that reader might eventually be, to understand something about this particular person that the bare facts of name and crime and method could not convey. These are not emotional passages. They are inflections, slight variations in the rhythm of a record that is otherwise as steady and as measured as a heartbeat, and they are the closest we will ever come to knowing what Franz Schmidt felt about the work he did for 45 years. Consider what it means to write a diary like this. Every few weeks or every few months, depending on the pace of the court's business, Schmidt sat down and recorded the death of another person. He chose what to include and what to leave out. He decided how much detail was enough. He made those decisions hundreds of times across decades, and the consistency of his choices across that span of time is itself a kind of portrait. A man who decided, at some point early in his career, what this record would be, and then maintained that decision through every execution and every punishment and every year without wavering. The discipline required is staggering. Not the discipline of the scaffold, the discipline of the pen. The scaffold demanded precision for 90 seconds. The diary demanded precision for 45 years. 361 executions. That is the number the diary records across Schmidt's career in Nuremberg, where he served as the city's executioner from 1578 until his retirement in 1617. 361 people whose lives ended under his sword, or on his gallows, or on his wheel. 361 names written in a hand that remained steady across decades. Each entry added to the one before it, like stones laid in a wall that grew higher with every year. He also recorded hundreds of lesser punishments, floggings, brandings, the cutting off of ears or fingers, the public shaming rituals that the court prescribed for offenses that did not warrant death but required visible physical consequences. Schmidt performed all of these with the same professional consistency that he brought to the scaffold. The diary records them with the same professional brevity. A name, an offense, a punishment, next entry. What the diary also reveals, indirectly and almost accidentally, is the scope of Schmidt's medical practice. Scattered among the execution entries are references to his work as a healer, patients treated, conditions addressed, remedies applied. Schmidt does not dwell on these entries any more than he dwells on the executions, but their presence in the diary tells us that he considered the healing to be part of the same professional life as the killing. Both were things he did. Both used the same knowledge of the human body. Both were worth recording. The sword and the ointment lived in the same diary because they lived in the same pair of hands. The crimes recorded in the diary form a portrait of a city in all its ordinary desperation: theft, robbery, murder, counterfeiting, arson, adultery, in periods when adultery carried capital punishment. Infanticide, which appears in the diary with a frequency that is quietly devastating, almost always committed by young women, almost always driven by the same combination of poverty and shame, and the absence of any other option that a society structured around female dependence and sexual morality made inevitable. Schmidt recorded these cases the same way he recorded every other case: name, crime, method. But the infanticide entries sometimes carry an extra sentence, a fragment of context, that suggests Schmidt understood something about the circumstances that the court's sentence did not acknowledge. He does not say the sentence was wrong. He does not argue for mercy. He simply provides a detail: the woman's age, the fact that she was unmarried, the absence of any family support, that lets the reader understand what the court apparently did not consider relevant. These are the cracks in the professional surface, small, deliberate, and devastating if you know how to read them. Schmidt was, by all surviving evidence, exceptionally good at his job. His execution record across 4 decades shows remarkably few complications. In an era when a botched beheading could end an executioner's career or life, Schmidt maintained a standard of precision that made him one of the most respected practitioners of his profession in the German-speaking world. Respected within the profession, that is. Within the small, closed network of executioner families who understood what the work required and could appreciate the skill it demanded. Outside that network, in the honorable world of guilds and taverns and church pews, Schmidt was what every executioner was: necessary, untouchable, unclean. And this is the part of Franz Schmidt's story that transforms everything else we have talked about tonight, from historical abstraction into something personal and urgent and real. Because Franz Schmidt spent his entire adult life pursuing one goal beyond the scaffold, one ambition that burned underneath every execution and every healing and every entry in the diary. He wanted to be declared honorable, not wealthy. He was already comfortable by the standards of his profession, not famous. He was already known throughout the region, honorable. He wanted the legal classification that would lift the stain from his family name. He wanted his children to be free to marry whom they chose. He wanted his sons to have the option of a life outside the scaffold if they wanted it. He wanted to walk into a tavern and sit down and order a drink and have nobody move away from the table. He wanted to attend a civic gathering without sensing the subtle rearrangement of bodies that happened whenever he entered a room, the way people shifted their weight and adjusted their positions to create a buffer of empty space around him without ever appearing to move at all. He wanted to die and be buried in consecrated ground without anybody questioning whether his soul deserved to rest there. He wanted, after 45 years of serving the city with absolute fidelity and absolute precision, to be treated as a human being whose hands were clean. The petition process took years. Schmidt first approached the city council of Nuremberg with his request, presenting his decades of service, his unblemished professional record, his contributions to the city's medical welfare, his good character, as attested by those willing to attest it. The council considered the petition. The council was sympathetic. The council was also bound by the same system of guild law and social classification that had made Schmidt dishonorable in the first place, and overturning that classification required more than local approval. It required imperial authority. Schmidt petitioned the emperor. The petition traveled through layers of bureaucracy that moved at the particular pace of early 17th century imperial administration, which is to say, it moved the way continents move, slowly, imperceptibly, with long stretches of absolute stillness punctuated by sudden, unpredictable shifts. The petition was reviewed. It was discussed. It was set aside. It was picked up again. Schmidt waited. He continued performing executions while he waited, which meant he was simultaneously asking to be freed from the stain of his profession while continuing to practice the profession that created the stain. The contradiction must have been extraordinary. Every execution he performed while the petition was pending was another entry in the diary and another argument against his own case. Every swing of the sword was another layer of dishonor applied to the very name he was trying to clean. In 1593, after years of effort, Schmidt received a partial victory. Emperor Rudolf II issued a letter that acknowledged Schmidt's service and granted a degree of rehabilitation to his family. But it was not the full declaration of honorable status that Schmidt had sought. It was a step, a recognition, a document that said, in the careful, non-committal language of imperial bureaucracy, that the emperor had noticed Franz Schmidt and was not entirely unsympathetic to his situation. The full restoration would take more years, more petitions, more waiting. Think about what that petition meant in human terms. A man walks into a building where the city's most powerful officials sit behind desks and handle the business of governance. He stands before them. He is the executioner. Every person in the room knows who he is and what he does. Some of them have signed the orders he carried out. Some of them watched from windows as the processions passed through the market square. And now this man, who has done everything the city ever asked of him, who has killed and tortured and disposed and healed and maintained the machinery of justice for decades without complaint, is asking them for one thing. He is asking them to say that he is clean, that his hands, which they have used for their own purposes for his entire adult life, are not stained, that the work they assigned him did not make him less than they are. The request is simple. The answer should be simple. And the fact that the answer required decades of petitioning and imperial intervention and bureaucratic deliberation tells you everything about the distance between what a society demands from a person and what it is willing to give back. Schmidt retired from the scaffold in 1617 at the age of 63. He had served as Nuremberg's executioner for nearly 40 years. He had killed 361 people. He had healed an unknown number more. He had raised a family inside the walls of dishonor, and done everything in his power to create a door in those walls that his children could walk through. After retirement, he continued his medical practice, which the city council now formally recognized. He was no longer the executioner who healed on the side. He was a healer who had formerly been the executioner. The distinction mattered. It mattered enormously, because the medical practice, stripped of its association with the scaffold, was an honorable occupation, and an honorable occupation was the first step toward the honorable status Schmidt had been pursuing for decades. Schmidt in retirement was a man in a strange kind of limbo. He was no longer the executioner, but he was still the former executioner. The stain did not wash off with the title. People who had watched him on the scaffold for decades did not suddenly forget what they had seen, because the city council had accepted his resignation. He walked the same streets. He passed the same neighbors. He attended the same church. The difference was that the sword was no longer in his hands, and the absence of the sword was the beginning, slowly, tentatively, of a different kind of life. A life where the healing could exist without the killing, where the ointment did not share a shelf with the blade, where the patients who came to his door did not have to reconcile the hands that treated them with the hands that had swung on the scaffold 2 days earlier. The retirement did not erase the past, but it created a gap between the past and the present, and in that gap, something like an ordinary life began to grow. The full declaration came eventually. The records suggest that Schmidt lived to see his family's status recognized, though the exact date and the exact terms of the final resolution are debated by historians who study these documents with the particular intensity that historians bring to questions that matter deeply and evidence that is frustratingly incomplete. What is not debated is that Franz Schmidt spent more of his life fighting for recognition than he spent on the scaffold. The killing was his job, the petition was his life's work, and the diary, the quiet, precise, emotionally restrained diary that recorded every death and every punishment and every healing across 4 decades, was his evidence, his testimony. His case, presented not to a court of law, but to the future, to the people who would eventually read it and understand what it meant to carry the sword and the stigma and the skill and the doubt for an entire lifetime, and still believe, against all evidence and all experience, that the world could be persuaded to see you as something other than what your hands had done. The diary survives. It sits today in an archive in Nuremberg. Scholars have transcribed it, translated it, analyzed it, and argued about it for generations. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the social history of early modern Europe, not because it contains dramatic revelations or hidden confessions, because it does not, because it is exactly what it appears to be. A record kept by a careful, quiet man who did a terrible job with extraordinary skill and wanted someone, someday, to know that he had been there, that he had existed, that the 361 people he killed had existed too, that their names were worth writing down, even if the world that sentenced them had already forgotten them before the ink was dry. Franz Schmidt's diary is the only reason we know most of what we know about the daily reality of a medieval executioner's life. Without it, we would have the civic records and the fee schedules and the guild complaints and the scattered references in church archives. We would have the outlines of a profession. With the diary, we have something closer to a life, not a full life. Schmidt did not write about his wife or his children or his feelings or his doubts. He wrote about his work, but work, for a man whose work was death, is not a narrow subject. It is everything. Every entry in the diary is a window into a world that the rest of his society preferred not to look at and could not function without. He opened that window with a pen and left it open for 400 years. If you are still awake, and it is perfectly fine if you are not, consider for a moment what Franz Schmidt would make of us, of the fact that we are lying in our beds 400 years after his last execution, listening to the story of his life as a way of falling asleep. He would probably find that strange. He might also find it appropriate, because sleep was the one part of his day that the profession could not touch. The scaffold waited outside, the diary waited on the table, the sword waited in its wrapping, but sleep, when it came, was his alone. The one territory where the executioner was not an executioner, where the hands that swung the blade and set the bone and sharpened the steel were just hands, resting, unclenched, belonging to nobody except the man they were attached to. We are doing, tonight, what Franz Schmidt did every night. We are setting down the weight of the day. We are letting the work wait until morning. We are trusting that the world will still be there when we open our eyes. The difference is that our work does not involve a sword and a scaffold and a crowd that might kill us if our hands shake. But the exhaustion is the same. The need for rest is the same. The way the body finally surrenders to the dark and the quiet and the knowledge that nothing more can be done until tomorrow, that is the same. And in that sameness, across 4 centuries and 1,000 miles, we are closer to the executioner than we have been at any other point tonight. And now the window is closing, gently, the way things close at the end of a very long night. You can close your eyes now, if you have not already. The story has told itself. The executioner has lived his life and done his work, and sharpened his blade, and healed his patients, and written his diary, and fought for his name, and rested, finally, in whatever peace a man like him could find. The candle in the executioner's house has burned low. The sword is wrapped in its oiled cloth, stored in the place where it always rests between uses. The knacker's yard is quiet. The scaffold in the market square stands empty, a wooden structure that looks, in the dark, like nothing more than a stage waiting for a performance that will not happen tonight. The city is asleep. The guards are walking their rounds on the walls. The baker is already awake, somewhere, starting the fires that will produce the bread that the city will eat in the morning. The world is turning the way it always turns, carrying everyone in it toward a tomorrow that will look very much like today. And in the house outside the walls, the executioner is lying in bed, listening to his wife breathe beside him, and he is thinking about something he will never write down, and never speak aloud, and never resolve. He is thinking about the weight of what he carries, not the sword. The sword is easy. The sword is steel and edge, an emotion he has practiced 10,000 times. The weight he carries is the knowledge that his city needs him the way a body needs a heartbeat, constant, essential, invisible when it is working, and that his city will never say so, and that he will wake up tomorrow and sharpen the blade and wait for the next piece of paper from the court and do the work again, because there is nobody else to do it, and because the work, despite everything it costs him, is his. It belongs to him the way nothing else in this city ever will. The room is dark now. The questions have gone quiet, and somewhere in a house outside the walls of a city that no longer exists, a man whose name was written in a diary that nobody was supposed to read is finally, after all these centuries, resting. Let him rest. He earned it. Every stroke, every entry, every petition, every patient healed through the back door at midnight, every silent walk home past neighbors who looked away. He earned this rest the way only a person who has carried something impossibly heavy for an impossibly long time can earn it, by setting it down, by closing his eyes, by letting the silence finally be just silence and nothing more. Good night.